Are you familiar with Old Shakopee Road in Bloomington, where there are Presbyterian churches by the old City Hall? Do you know where that is, like on Penn and Old Shakopee? Okay, so that's like one of the earliest churches ever. You know, that was a Gideon Pond church originally. Not that church building, but that's exactly where it was. And the Anderson family, so think of living down by where Jerry's is, you know, by Anderson Lakes in that area, or by the mall. They would take oxen and in their cart and all their kids, and they'd all go all that way to go to church. So they'd get up when it was still dark, and then they didn't want anyone to see their oxen. You know, you don't want church people to see your oxen, so you put the oxen way off to the side, and then you walk the remainder like mile to get to church. So that was the church originally, and we'll get more on the churches. Back to Miller's Store. Miller's Store burned down in the 60s, and it had been abandoned for about 10 years. This place was like the highlight of Eden Prairie. They had a piano on the upper level. They had dances up there. Remember, they're Catholic. They're having fun. They're making moonshine in the backyard. Not like those Methodists, you know. So they were having a good time over there, and it was City Hall. It's where they had their voting, their meetings. They voted on if they should build a consolidated school there. All these things happened at the Miller Store. Kate Miller was a gracious woman. She invited everybody over on Christmas Eve for oyster stew. They had ice cream parties. Don Rogers told me when he was a little boy, he remembers going with a horse and wagon up to Miller's on a hot night, and his dad treated everybody to ice cream. So they were like the place to hang out, the community gathering spot. They had 4 sons, and how many of you remember Eden Prairie Road when all those houses were still there? Yep, and they were cute. They were really cool. It really told a cool story because, you know, the store was gone, but Grandma and Grandpa Miller had a farm way back in Miller Park, so they owned all that land, and Mitchell Lake was part of their land too. And then they have their 4 sons had these cute houses along Eden Prairie Road, and I think the last one was torn down like early 90s. And I remember the paper was written up, eyesore finally gone, and I thought, oh, they just don't get it. They don't get what they did. But anyway, this is a fun picture. Sadly, a lot of the stuff burned, and a lot of our documents, a lot of our records were burned. And the story is that there was a basketball game, and some kids came, and I'm not sure if it was Bloomington or Shakopee. They were causing ruckus in the Eden Prairie Cemetery. They were tipping some stones and doing some stuff like that. And they got cold, so they went into Miller's Store. They started the wood-burning stove, and then they left. So that's what happened there. All right, the early days, there's Fred and Kate, elderly there. That is Eden Prairie Road, right there next to them. And Miller's Store right there, you can kind of see a little bit of a sign up there. And then down below, beer on draught, right there. And there's that old car, pretty cute. And then over here on the left, swimming, that's Art Miller, and that's down at Lake Riley. I like the swimming suits. All right. And here we've got our one-room school. So the Jarrett School was right by, well, really right across the street from Little Red, and that was the Jarrett School. They were all named for the people that donated their land for the school. The Gould School was right where Marshall's Market is today, on the corner of Eden Prairie Road and Pioneer Trail. And that's a picture in the middle of the Gould School. They were doing, the real picture is so beautiful. The chalk drawing is just amazing on it, but they were celebrating Declaration Day there. And then the Anderson School is right where Sears is in the parking lot. That was Anderson. And then down below in the middle is the old Anderson School when it was a log cabin. So that was the very first one. And then the Wolf School was where Pax Christi is, basically. And the steps to the school were there up until about 10 years ago when they built those homes right along there. But the steps were still there. So it was pretty amazing. So the city is kind of like that today, where we have our 4 elementary schools kind of divided up around. And then we have the consolidated school that came around. It cost $100,000 to build it. And it was a pretty big deal, and it caused a big ruckus between a couple of families, basically the Mitchells and the Douglas family. So there was a big feud on where it should go. A lot of people wanted it to be in the center of the town, and the center of the town is pretty much where City Hall is. And the Mitchells wanted it over there. Well, the Douglas, Sheldon Douglas from Smith Douglas Morehouse, he had become the chair of the school board because he was the only educated person who had actually gone to college in Eden Prairie at that time. And he wanted it to be on his land. Well, it really was a bad fight, a really nasty fight. People were going in and painting other people's horses red, like doing all kinds of nasty things about this, but at the end of the day, it became on the Douglas property. So I want you to imagine what this would have been like to enter a building like this. You live on a farm, you've been walking to school, holding hot potatoes in your hands, that your mother made for you that morning, putting it on the wood-burning stove when you got to school to eat for lunch, and that long walk, and suddenly you have this school and a bus, and granted, it took a long time on the bus, but pretty big deal, and you arrive at school, and they have a drinking fountain, they have running water, they have flush toilets, which you don't have. You don't have that in 1924. Most people didn't even get electricity or running water until the late 30s in Eden Prairie. Miller's store and the school were the only two places in town that had that. So, you walk in, there's this gym. Can you imagine that big gym? And Ralph Nesbitt and Al Pica used to talk about, they were on the basketball team, and they said it was just amazing because there were no poles to hold up the ceiling. Other schools had poles that they had to run around and avoid, and Carver had a potbelly stove to keep the room warm, and if your basketball hit that, you had to sit out for a while until they got that all back together again. So this was a state-of-the-art gym. You can see the gym down there where it's decorated for prom in 1937. So what happened is that gym became the new town hall, and that's where everybody hung out. And my favorite story is that women used to go there on Tuesdays, and they got plug-in irons. They didn't have those at home, and they would iron together. So there were ironing boards all around the gym, and they'd plug in their electric irons, and they'd get to iron together. I just love that. And they had prom, they had plays on the stage, they had basketball, because football didn't come to Eden Prairie until 1958. And that was Kurt Conity that brought that. But basketball was our homecoming, everything. And graduation ceremony, everything was in that room. Seaver Peterson talks about, as a kid, they would go behind the bleachers to get their food, and if you were a high school student, you got to sit on the floor at a table. But if you were an elementary kid, you sat up in the bleachers and ate your lunch there. So the gym was like all day long being repurposed over and over and over again. And I love the students here in front of the building. There were a lot of play groups, and then the cool old car there. We have a lot of pictures of this school and a lot of stories about it. I'm going to put together a story next month in the Sun Current about how things have changed, like the school song. And the school colors used to be more of a scarlet red, more of a burgundy red, and now it's more of that orangey red. So it's kind of fun to see how things change. All right, here's our churches. The Methodist Church was where Grace Church is today, but more on the corner. And the Presbyterian Church was in front of Pleasant Hill Cemetery on Pioneer Trail. Hard to imagine that, because the road practically goes right up to the cemetery now. So imagine that the church was in front of that. And then there was a house across the street that was where the pastor lived. And I think the Methodist pastor lived in a house on Eden Prairie Road that's still there today too. But this church, the Presbyterian Church, wasn't that a beautiful church? It's so sad that they tore it down. It's just a beautiful church. And I love to look at this picture with a magnifying glass and look at all those faces, because they're just so interesting. The Episcopal Church was a little church in the woods, and it was right next to the Cummins house where you're going later today. It was kind of tucked back in there, and it didn't last long, maybe a year. And they moved it there. Isn't that amazing how they used to move buildings all the time back then? They moved it there. So it was kind of made out of logs. All right, we've got some early homes. We've got the Goodrich Hotel up there. So if you're familiar with Steve Schussler's barn on Pioneer Trail, that's now an event center, and you look at that big field there, that's where that house was. And people used to come in by train, and they would be taken by horse and buggy by Old Black Joe, that's what he was called back then, and he worked for the Goodrich Hotel, and he had one of those ones with a little surrey, you know, the fringe, and he'd pick up guests when they got there on the depot, and he'd take them over to the Goodrich, and some families would actually stay there for the summer. They had cottages, and it was on Staring Lake. So we had our own little resort. And they also had a post office. The Goodrich post office was across the street with like a little store across the way. The right side, you'll see the Smith Douglas Morehouse, and that's Mary Smith. Mary Smith and her husband, Sheldon Smith, came here in the 1850s, and they were 22 and 26 years old. They came here from New York, Pike, New York, and they came here by river. You know, back in those days, that's the only way to get here. And they must have had some money. We're kind of doing some research on this as we're starting to work on the timeline, but they must have had money. They built a cabin by Duck Lake, and they had one child, Nettie, that died, and she's buried up at the Eden Prairie Cemetery. And they bought the land. It's interesting, they bought this land where the train was going to come in 1860. So it's like 200 acres that they bought. So it's pretty interesting that they knew, they had that foresight. And he was a farmer, and then they had the two girls. They had Amy and Etta, were their two daughters. And they built this home, and they moved in. We thought that it was built in 1877, but new research is showing it might have been earlier than that. And it was a showcase. I mean, it had that beautiful scroll, beautiful trim, the red brick from Shakopee. The Cummins has the yellow brick from Chaska. This one was the red brick, and they built it with 5 bedrooms upstairs with the idea that when the train came that people could spend the night there, so it would be kind of like a B&B. And they also had preachers and teachers that stayed there all the time. Kind of a fun story about Rogers. Harry Rogers and the family actually lived, they had a hired man's house for help with the farm, and Harry Rogers' mother brought Harry in to see Amy when Amy was there, and said, something's wrong with Harry, he just won't eat, his digestive system isn't working right, I'm afraid he's going to die. And Amy said, I'll take him in, and she brought him into the south bedroom upstairs, and she started feeding him oatmeal, and he came through and grew to have the market there. It was actually originally Harry Rogers Market that was up there before the Marshalls. And then later, the Rogers family lived in the house as well to help out. So, trying to keep this shorter because I could go on forever about this family. I love this family so much. So Amy later got into telegraphy, and she ended up being a railroad depot agent along with her father. And she bought more land. She was very wealthy. She had married a teacher from the Jarrett School that boarded there, and they had gone up to Montana to Helena, and they lost a child, and then they had Sheldon Douglas, and her husband unfortunately died at age 28 of meningitis. So she came back with Sheldon and lived with her mother. Her father had died, and she lived with her 60-year-old mother, and they bought more land, and they became very wealthy people. And she never married again, much to the dismay of all of the men in town, because she was always loved by Eden Prairie men. She was in a Sunday school at the Methodist Church, and there were many, many that courted her, that wanted to marry her. She was very beautiful, she was smart, and she had money. She kind of had it all. And she never remarried. Instead, she kind of became the town matriarch. People went to get loans from her. She would lend out money or give money. She was a very lovely, lovely person. Etta died of tuberculosis when she was 16. At that time, Amy was 18. It took me a long time to find this out. I had to go to the State Historical Society and look through records to find out how did this Amy, or this beautiful little Etta die. And they called it consumption back then. And I found letters that were in the attic of the house. The granddaughter of Earl Moore gave them to me. There was over 200 letters, and they're all from the 1870s and 1880s. And back then, you have to understand that the postman came twice a day. So you could send a letter to your friend in the farmhouse up the hill, and you get a response by the afternoon. So it's kind of like emailing back then. And the postman knew everything. He knew everything. He shared the gossip with everybody. She was best friends with Mary Lucas, and Mary Lucas lived in the house on Scenic Heights that has the big chair. So that is an old farmhouse, and that's where she lived. And it seems like, well, that's close, but imagine weather like today, or, you didn't have a car, and there were big farms, so it was nice to write letters. The letters tell amazing, amazing stories about this family. They talk about going to Excelsior Amusement Park on Big Island, on the island in those days, eating too much cotton candy, getting sick. They talk about going to the circus in Minneapolis when it was under a tent. And the tent's blowing so hard, they're scared they're all going to get blown over. They worked for the train, so they got probably passes, what we call passes in those days, to take the train all over the place. So they have great stories. When Etta died, there's stories about the family coming from New York, and they took clippings of her hair and put them into lockets. And her death was horrible. I mean, a very, very sad, sad death. And I read a lot of letters that she had written to friends and they'd written back. And it's hard, you feel like you get to know her. And she was a beautiful, beautiful person and very human. She writes about how Amy gets to go to work and she has to stay there and do lady chores, which are not fun. And she wishes she had a job. It's interesting for 1878. And they're very heartwarming. And she does have a cemetery stone up at the Eden Prairie Cemetery. It was missing the picture. You could tell there had been a picture of her. And so the Historical Society, we talked with Huber Funeral Home, and they made up a new one. It's on a stone, her picture's on a stone, and it's now up there. And she has a beautiful, beautiful poem that her family wrote about her. So if you ever get a chance on a nice day, it's really amazing to go look at the cemeteries here in Eden Prairie. We have beautiful, beautiful cemeteries. Okay, so in the middle, we've got the Cummins-Phipps Grill House. And then on the left, there's the Doran-Kipper house that was moved that I told you was built out of logs. We do have, in the parlor, we put plexiglass over a section so you can see the old mud and hay chinking that's in between the logs. And a lot of the logs were tamarack. In the schools, they made the benches out of tamarack so kids would pick at the gummy stuff. And it was like gum. They would chew it. And that's probably where the first under the started. Down below, we have the Reggae House. Do any of you remember the Reggae House? Yeah. It was where Grace Church is today.
Do all these houses still exist?
Not the Reggae. All the rest are there. So the Reggae on the bottom left is not there any longer. Had beautiful stained glass windows in it, had been in their family. Kind of a cool story about Jessie James. So I guess I heard this from Iona Reggae. She told me this story and she has it written down that when, let's see, I think it would have been her father was a little boy, because that house had been there. The Reggaes arrived here from the East Coast by river, so 1850s. And so they carried all their stuff up the hill with ox carts, and they had money. They had run a general store or something. And they had a house prior to this one. I think this one was built in 1890. So anyway, she says that her grandfather or father, I have to look that up again, said that these men came through their farm and they wanted to drink from their well. And they had black shiny boots and kind of long coats, and they looked a little frightening. So they were told to stay in the house, and they spent the night around the well, and they just left them alone. And it was like 2 days later that happened in Northfield. So they passed right through, stopped at the Reggae Farm. It was a beautiful, beautiful farm, and it's right where Grace Church is today. Okay, then we have the Riley Jake property, which is down on Lake Riley. How many of you have been to the barn for an event? Yeah, it's great. And right now the city has someone renting the house. He is a son of 2 teachers of Eden Prairie. He's an artist. His wife is a nurse, and they're renting right now. And he does, do you know Nate Lovis? Have you heard that name? Yeah, he does beautiful art, and he's living it and caretaking it very nicely. And then we have the Halassic. So if you've been down at the Camp Edenwood camp, that's a Halassic house that was moved there. And they actually use it for exchange students that come and work at the camp, live there. They've kind of turned it into like a dorm. So that house is saved. The one up above is my house. And it looks a little different. And you can see how tiny it was when it was first built. And the whole upstairs of our house was for hired men. It was built just for hired men. So we had no divisions, you know, originally. And I don't think it had that until the late 40s. Because people used to hang their laundry up there. You know, they'd freeze dry it and hang it up there. So I have to thank my husband. He's doing a presentation for the Lions Club, and he kind of did this. Katie sent the pictures, and they did it in a day. Because we didn't even have this. We're so busy with what we're working on at the homes, and we're working on all of our artifacts right now. We're getting a new computer program, so we're taking pictures of every donation that we've ever had, recataloging it, so we're kind of busy, but I'm really glad you invited us because this is fun and it gets us going and gives us a PowerPoint, which is kind of fun. We had a slide thing, and I was kind of embarrassed to do that. All right, so we've got the 20th century. Anybody here ever go to the Flying Cloud movie theater that used to be up there? You've done everything. I'm glad you're here. I went to it in the very last year that it was there in 1988. And they used to have a merry-go-round or little rides for kids, and they had a carousel that had wood horses. And Bob Brown, I don't know if you remember Truby Brown, but he happened to be driving by one day, and he saw a big fire, and he saw them burning all the wood horses. And so he grabbed 3 of them before they were burned, and he donated 1 to us. So in our museum at City Hall, we have one, and we have that picture up by it, so you can see that. Up there in the middle, that is Pioneer Trail and Highway 212, and you can see the old hay shocks, you know, the way they used to do it, kind of like the Amish do it today. And then we have over on the right, that is Eden Prairie Road. And that is the old Kruger Soam House. Does that ring a bell with anybody? Do you know where Beverly Drive is? And it's all different now, completely different. Houses everywhere, but on the corner of Beverly Drive and Eden Prairie Road, there is a cute little blue house, and that is this house. It's still there, and I hope it gets to stay there amongst all the mansions, but that house is still there, and it's built out of logs. It's another one that was built by Geisler. Geisler was a builder back in the 1860s, and a lot of them were built not to be a log home, but to be built out of logs, and then have this on top of it. Arlene Marshall lived in the Rogers, Norm Rogers family's home, and that was a log home as well. And then we have the Outlook, which we can't go to anymore because of the airport. It's in a fly zone that they don't, we talked to them about, we'd really, really love to restore this and allow people to picnic in there again, and they just are not in favor of it because of the fly zone right there. But that's the way that it was, and you used to be able to drive in there. Now Jim Clark, our retired police chief, always tells me that there was a lot of trouble up there too. A lot of making out and beer drinking. And then down there we have the famous Y. So that's 212 where the mall is. So let's see if I can. So there's the Y, and then this is the mall. here. And I believe this is an Anderson. There's some Nesbitt family in here. And let's see, that would go off to 5 up in there today. So Roger Pauley grew up in the Pauley farmhouse, which is still there on Highway 5. And he was our city attorney for many, many, many years. And his wife, Sydney, also served in politics here. But anyway, he used to say when he was a little boy, he would go out on Highway 5. It was a dirt road, and he'd play trucks in the dirt. And that's not that long ago, you know, when you think about it. So let's get to the last one, and we'll talk about questions here. History's alive today. So we've got the Cummins House with a beautiful peony garden, over 500 plants that are original, that are still there, that we have from Mrs. Phibbs. And then on the right, the Dorenkemper, and then we've got the barn, the Riley barn. Or no, I'm sorry, that's Schussler's barn in the middle. And then on the left is the Riley barn. And the children's camp, that's a National Register site. You are welcome to go there and walk around the grounds. If you've never been there, it's an amazing gem that we have. It was a children's tuberculosis camp in the 20s and 30s, and it was affiliated with the Glen Lake Sanitarium. And this side was just for children. And we learned something interesting, that children in those days got tuberculosis from unpasteurized milk. And so it was a different kind of tuberculosis than what adults got. So if you had them together, it could actually be very devastating for the adult. So they always had to keep them separate. And they believed in sunshine as their cure. So if you look at old pictures of the camp, the kids are always shirtless, you know, just wearing shorts and running around playing. That is down by the river in the middle. And there's that outlook, what it looks like today, which is sad. And then we've got the Frederick Miller Spring up there. That was considered holy water by the Native Americans, and it used to be on the opposite side of the road, and it just kind of ran off the cliff, off the bluff. And whenever they had someone ill in a tribe, they would actually go get that water. They felt that it was healing. So any questions on anything? Anything you'd like to know more about, any families?
We're from Grand Rapids, and we're recently moved here. We live on Lake Pokegama, and there's a Nesbitt Island in Lake Pokegama. Is that any relation to the Nesbitt family we're talking about?
I don't know, but we could look in the files. We have the history of the Nesbitts in the files. I believe they're Scotch-Irish too. And they have land in Bloomington. The other thing that's kind of interesting about all these early farmers, when you look at the map, you'll see like they have a plot of land here, and there's a little square. That means it's a house, it's a dwelling there. And then you'll look and they'll say, oh, they've got all this land down by the river. Why would they do that? And it's because they wanted a forest area for lumber. So they would have their land where they lived, and then they owned land to get the wood. So a lot of them have amazing amounts of land. And there was a Starring, J.R. Starring. He did live on Starring Lake, so kind of where that, you know, where the sledding hill is, and there's that pavilion there. He lived there. And he had the first post office and the first school in his house, way, way, way back. And he used to breed stallions. And he's the one that brought our 2 African-American people to Eden Prairie, because he met them in the South when he went to go buy horses. And he had them ride in the cars with the horses and promised them work in Eden Prairie. So we had 2 in Eden Prairie. We had Monroe Barker. He died in 1942, and they say he was way over 100 years old. He worked at the Miller store. He took care of the horses. He ate dinner with them every night. There's a really nice story about, not a nice in this part of it, but sales reps would come through Miller store all the time. They'd come on the train, and they'd stay overnight at Smith Douglas Morehouse, and they'd eat with the Millers. And they were sitting around to eat, and Monroe came to sit at the table, and the man stood up and said, "I'm not sitting here with him." And he said, "Well, then you're not sitting with us. You're not welcome at our table. He's family." And that was Kate Miller. That was Kate. The other one, known as Old Black Joe, We didn't know anything about him, but I did find out that he lived in my attic. I found out that when he first came to Eden Prairie, he was a hired man, and he lived upstairs. And I didn't know anything about this, and I'll tell you this, but don't tell anybody else. My husband will be mad at me. So when we first bought our house in 1988, we were upstairs in our bedroom, we're sleeping, and all of a sudden he sat up and he said, "Oh my gosh, I just had a dream. I just had the weirdest dream." And he said, "I saw an old black man, disheveled, in old clothes, and he was like pushing this sleigh thing, and it had wood, and he was headed right over there." And I thought, well, that's really weird. So about a year later, I'm reading this book, and it says that old black Joe lived with Francois Lariviere. And I thought, well, that's bizarre. And so then I started researching, where is he buried? And then it says later in the book that he never ever had a tombstone, that he was buried in the poor man's lot at the Eden Prairie Cemetery. So then I reached out to Mike Rogers, who runs that, years ago, and they said they checked when they widened the road and all that, and they never found him. So then we decided, the Historical Society, I talked him into it. We needed to get a tombstone for Joe. And so first I looked down at the state historical records and found out his name was Joseph Graham. He was from Tennessee. Both of these men fought in the Civil War, so they were old. But this one died in like 1900, so Monroe lived to be, 1942. So anyway, we now have a tombstone and all story about Joseph Graham. He's not old black Joe, he's Joseph Graham, and he has a resting spot. So we won't see him in our house anymore now. But it was really weird that happened, because it spurred me to do that, It's kind of strange how things happen like that. But we have so many stories. I mean, truly, we love to have you visit the museum. I still find things that I pick up and read. The Anderson family all did stories about their lives, and they came here when we still had the Native Americans living here, and they would just come right into their homes, and they loved sweets, so they would like hand the homeowner a bunch of ducks, in exchange for a cookie, because they didn't have that. And they were very, very friendly, and during the uprising that happened in '62, Chief Chaska was a friendly, and he actually protected Eden Prairie white settlers, from that, because most of it was really a New Ulm, that was happening there. But people were scared here too, and they were congregating, into a church or into a building. A lot of them were in the Gould School, I learned later. But just really fascinating stories, and you realize what these people, they endeavored the grasshopper invasion that lasted 3 years and killed all their crops, and anything hanging on the clothesline was gone, and a lot of them left from that. There were suicides back then over things like that. So these people went through a lot, when they first came here to live, but it was a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful place to come to.
What was the, where did you go for medical help?